2005, I became aware of I wouldn't call him exactly a UFO researcher. I think he would have objected to that term. We'll see why in a few minutes. His name was Mac Tonnies, and when I first became aware of him, it was because he had written something particularly unpleasant about me. He wrote, "Whitley Strieber has written his most expansive, bizarre online journal entry yet. As usual, it poses far more questions than it answers. And for a metaphysical rallying cry, it's peculiarly insistent that readers who truly support his website send him money so they can access some superfluous subscriber material." So, naturally, I wasn't. He went on in this genre mode for quite a while, and then it was followed by a long list of comments about me, most of them very unpleasant. But then suddenly, toward the end of this list, and what ended the list, I guess, was someone who wrote something quite unexpected to me. This man wrote this: "I lived on the same road to Strieber when he had his little cabin in Accord, New York. Frankly, there was a light that would come over his place at night. It would sometimes make a noise as well, a faint sort of moaning sound. I must have seen it dozens of times." And then he goes on to say that the area was frightening and it had quieted down since I left, and they were all glad I had gone. For quite a few years, I tried to find out who said that, because there were only a few people who lived on that road. Nobody's been willing to own up to it, but if it did anything, it stopped the fusillade of comments saying I was a nut and all of these things. So when Mac died last year, I was hesitant to do anything about it, but a dear friend of Mac's, Mike Cleland, has wanted to talk about him and about his work, and there's much more to Mac than those particular comments. Mac takes a very interesting viewpoint about the whole phenomenon, and his last book, The Cryptoterrestrials, is now available, and I think it's well worth taking a look at Mac and his work. Now that we no longer have him with us, and even before, I should have probably done this while he was alive, but who knew that a man would die suddenly at the age of 34? So now I welcome his good friend, Mike Cleland, to Dreamland to talk about Mac. Welcome, Mike.
When you first asked me to talk about Mac, I was a little bit hesitant because I didn't want to put words into his mouth, but at the same time, he was quite a good friend, and I was deeply honored to know him. And just to have this chance to talk about him and to praise him would be just felt great. So.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. Mac had a very unique take. Well, perhaps we'd better say first, after just passing over his untimely death so quickly, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what happened.
Well, I talked to Mac's mother shortly after his death, and she called me up out of the blue. I did illustrations for the book, which was published posthumously, which is titled The Cryptoterrestrials. And she called me up to thank me for doing the illustrations. And Mac was 34 years old, and I talked to him in the middle of 2009. He died on October 18th of 2009, and he had an event where he had a fainting spell, and he went to the hospital, and they did a lot of tests on him, and he was young and healthy, and they couldn't quite factor anything in, and it was presumed to be some heart issue, and he died, as far as anyone knows, peacefully in his sleep. He was found in bed, and of some sort of heart arrhythmia. So just basically his heart stopped, and no one has a good answer to exactly why that happened. But there was a previous condition where he did end up in the hospital getting tests, where he had passed out at his place of work, and that would have been less than a year before his very untimely death.
So he had, basically what you're saying is that he had an occult heart condition, and that's very sad because those I guess they can be hard to detect. In any case, we lost a fascinating researcher, and what made him fascinating to me was his refusal to accept the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I'm also good friends with Jacques Vallée, and I think that he respected Jacques Vallée's work very much. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis is?
Well, the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis is, and he got that term from someone else on his blog. He for almost 7 or 8 years he had been keeping an online blog called Post-Human Blues.
Yes.
Much of it was just musings and oftentimes funny little things, but at the same time he would include a lot of his own writing and a lot of his own thoughts. And he began pondering the fact that maybe these things that we call extraterrestrials, that we in our pop culture have an image of these characters, coming down on metal spaceships to perform scientific experiments and collect data. In essence, we're anthropomorphizing them to be us. That's exactly what we do when we go to the moon. We take soil samples and fly in metal spaceships. So in essence, that's very easy for us to grasp in a pop culture sort of metaphor. But he was curious whether whatever they might be, and he was very cautious to when he was speculating to in essence say I'm speculating and not treat anything as not dogma. But there's very little evidence that they're from outer space. In fact, there's no evidence that they're from outer space, except for the fact that every once in a while someone will have a conversation with them and they'll say they're from a place in outer space. But he was curious whether they were somehow sharing our world with us right now, and somehow whether they were had been here in an ancient form of intelligence that had been sharing the planet with us, or a somehow hidden or impoverished non-human intelligence that shared the planet with us, and whether they were somehow, if they had a skill, the skill would be a skill of almost deception, where what we perceive as a magical or paranormal set of experiences that come from our interaction with them, those same experiences could very much be just a perceptive trick that they can play on us. So by the mere fact that they share the planet with us, they would be deeply concerned with how we, the dominant species on the planet, are taking care of this fragile Earth.
There is in his book, in the Cryptoterrestrials, he makes this statement: I propose that at least some accounts of alien visitation can be attributed to a humanoid species indigenous to the Earth, a sister race that has adapted to our numerical superiority by developing a surprisingly robust technology. And I have to say I've wondered about that question very much, because in my experience, some of the visitors would come up out of the ground. And one of the places I met them most frequently and openly was in a cave. And there were occasional UFO events, and as the man who wrote into Mac's blog said, people apparently saw lights over my cabin at night and heard that sound, and it was very disturbing to them. Obviously, they didn't like having me around because these were their weekend vacation homes and places of rest, and suddenly they're having this frightening thing happen to them. I can well understand their discomfort. I felt the same discomfort, if anything, more acutely. But in any case, the question is, if they are really here, is this technology we're looking at, or something more like an adaptive phenomenon, something that enables them to perhaps move between parallel universes? And if they are here, perhaps this isn't their home. Perhaps this is simply the neighborhood. How do you react to those possibilities, both as yourself and also speaking on behalf of Mac?
I feel pretty confident answering that because Mac and I had a lot of late-night phone conversations about exactly what you just brought up. And he talks about it in the book, and he definitely talked about it at great length with me, that that this book, he was in no way wedded to this hypothesis. He simply wanted to do a thought experiment and to just to take a look at the phenomena in a way that hadn't been looked at in any depth. and just to see if it had legs and to see if it had any merit to it. And so the thought of the parallel dimensions is something he was very intimate with and very familiar with, and he purposely, for the process of the book, just decided to leave that out. And he would reference Vallée and the thought experiment, in his thought experiment, and but then just try to keep to the fact that these very much could be, speculating, could be, flesh and blood creatures that had some sort of gift where they could share our planet with us, and somehow trick us into thinking that they were from another planet. He at the end of all his emails, he would, the little byline that you put there, the little signature line. He put a short little quote from Terence McKenna, which I think he really liked, and I have it written in front of me here. And the quote from was, "We are part of a symbolic relationship with something which disguises itself as an extraterrestrial invasion, as so not to alarm us." And I think he really took that one to heart. I think that fascinated him, that concept.
I've always thought that quote was extraordinarily absurd, and the thing that makes it so absurd is that an extraterrestrial invasion is exactly what would alarm us. You see,
and I think he loved the playfulness of that open absurdity. And,
right, exactly. I think he did too, and I think it's a fascinating prospect, the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis. There's another question, though, that enters my mind here, and that is, I don't know that Mac was ever aware of this, but the implant surgeries that have gone on, which I suspect he probably would have rejected as being a joke. But they're
and I can say from he did not reject those as a joke, and we talked at great length about those.
Did he know about what the implants are made of?
He was very familiar with the work of Roger Lehr, and I had befriended a fellow who goes by the name of John Smith on your
yes.
He's been interviewed.
Yes, I know who you're speaking of.
Yes, and I've met him several times, and we've become pals. I just saw him recently in February, and so he was very intimate and quite fascinated with that whole prospect. So he was very open-minded to that.
Well, subscribers, incidentally, amid the superfluous material in our subscriber section, you can listen to the interview with John Smith. It's quite interesting. In any case, they are, of course, made of meteoric iron, and the most recent one that was removed, or not the most recent, but the John Smith implant, was recorded with it had a strong local magnetic field. It was broadcasting in a high frequency FM frequency, or nearly microwave frequency, when it was on site in John Smith's body, and subsequently it was found to be made of meteoric iron, and at least there is growing evidence that the isotopic ratios of the material in it are off. In other words, that it's not even from this solar system, let alone this planet. And that I found all very interesting, and I wish that Mac was with us to comment on it, because one of the things that I thought was so expert in doing was talking about just how much this whole process of encounter, or whatever it is, resides in the question. It stays in the question. You can never, the closer, it's like a fata morgana, the closer you get to it, the farther away it gets. And we'll be talking a little bit more about this whole issue of the question and what it may mean, and the sinister aspects of this, because something is just plain wrong. We'll be right back. Subscribers, we're going to be playing 2 clips from Mac Tonnies' interviews in this program, and you'll be able to listen to more clips in the unknowncountry.com subscriber section of this most interesting man. And for those of you who didn't get an autographed copy of the Omega Point by taking advantage of the subscription renewal offer, be sure and pick one up at your local bookstore. Get it off the internet. It's getting great reviews and great reader comments on our message boards. And I think it's a big success, apparently, and I'm very happy and very excited about it. I'd love to know what you think when you read it. So if you do read it, please send a comment to whitley@strieber.com or put one up on our message board. And if you have read it and would be willing to record a testimonial about it, write me at whitley@strieber.com with the subject heading testimonial.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. This is The Edge of the World.
We're back with Mike Cleland talking about the work of his friend Mac Tonnies. Mac passed away unexpectedly at the age of 34 in 2009 of apparently an occult heart ailment. Mac was one of the most interesting in the younger group of investigators of this remarkable phenomenon that we call speak of under the umbrella of the visitor phenomenon. Mac was not necessarily a believer in the extraterrestrial hypothesis or any other hypothesis. His new book, The Cryptoterrestrials, is a most interesting and well thought out take on what this may or may not be. And now, before we go on, we're going to listen to a clip of a radio program that Mac did some years ago, a brief clip of Mac's own voice telling us a little bit about himself and his work and introducing us to it.
Yeah, the cryptoterrestrial idea is basically a synthesis of other ideas that have been around for a while but never quite in this form. I'm kind of drawing on research by Jacques Vallée, John Keel, even Graham Hancock to some degree, thinkers like that, unorthodox ideas that we're sharing the planet with a non-human intelligence. And specifically that this intelligence is responsible in large part for the UFO phenomenon as we know it. You know, it's an appealing theory on some levels, but on other levels it's quite off-putting because it recalls some very lame ideas like Richard Shaver's idea of the hollow earth populated by degenerate robots and stuff like that. Yeah. So it has a certain kook factor to it that some people sense immediately and use to, you know, denigrate it. Which is fine because there's always area for disagreement. But I've grown increasingly uncomfortable with the extraterrestrial hypothesis as the final word for what UFOs must be if they're not some sort of psychological manifestation or whatever. Yeah. I think that this is a much wider inquiry, and if you look at the present state of ufology, you find that it's very addicted to the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Yeah. It's almost like, well, it's either a natural phenomenon or it's aliens, and I think that's far too simplistic. I still think that the questions outweigh the possible explanations. So I am simply attempting to come up with a thought experiment, and posing the question to researchers: why can't this work? Why? What's unscientific about this? Yeah. You know, this is something that's conceivably testable given sufficient resources. And I'm not proposing, incidentally, that these non-humans that share the planet with us are from another dimension, and that's one of the pretty integral ideas behind Vallée's idea of the multiverse, for example. Yeah. I'm simply stating that these are flesh and blood creatures. You know, they might have some advantageous abilities that might be called psychic, for lack of a better term. But I don't think we're dealing with something quote-unquote paranormal so much as anthropological.
Well, Mike, that's a good introduction to Mac's work, I think. And he said in his book, The Cryptoterrestrials, am I a ufologist? I don't know, maybe. If I am, I should probably qualify the U word with theoretical. There are theoretical physicists and theoretical literary theorists. Why not theoretical ufologists? The ufology community suffers from creative anemia. It has a disheartening tendency to refute dissenting voices with tired screed. And I could not agree with that statement more. I am a dissenting voice very often, although perhaps Mac and I descended in different ways. And you talk about tired screed. I live with tired screed. But let's go beyond that and beyond this whole issue, because I don't know if you listen regularly to Dreamland, but a few weeks ago we had an interview with a man who had been working in Indonesia called Alan Lammers, working on the island of Sulawesi, where people are disappearing with disturbing regularity under the most peculiar circumstances. They're liable to be attacked if they wear colored clothing in the jungles around this particular group of villages. And one man who finally returned was found after months of wandering in the jungle, apparently, said that his hiking group was followed by some small, very strange and ominous-looking creatures with wide mouths that were kind of blurred, and when they smiled, the mouths proved to be filled with teeth, and it was a terrifying description, made more terrifying by the fact that all of the other hikers disappeared completely and have never been seen again, among many people. Now, I want to ask you, you have examined this and investigated this a great deal in your own right. So had Mac. If this is a species living on planet Earth, or perhaps a group of species, all with the same remarkable capabilities of deception, what kind of danger might we be facing? What's your impression of this?
Well, my personal impression is it's hard to know. It seems like at the very fringes of the the stuff that gets studied and the stuff that gets researched, there's these I almost want to say whisperings. No one wants to bring it to the table. There's these whisperings of the mutilation phenomena, where not the cattle mutilation, but actual human mutilation, and they're very quick to be disappeared from the data pool. It's almost like these things are so scary that they get excised from the research community, and people won't look at them. And there's a lot of folks that have a very benevolent view of what's happening, and there is an element to it that certainly matches that. But the thing that I can't answer what it may be. The thing that is almost more disturbing is the fact that we are capable of dismissing them so outright in the research pool.
Well, there is, yes. I wrote a book, turned out as a graphic novel with a friend called Craig Spector, called The 9 Incidents, about a group of such incidents that I had heard of. And what was so frightening to me about these incidents was that they took place all within a short distance, within 30 or 40 miles of my cabin. And they took place in the years after I left the cabin. And I thought to myself, I used to go out in the woods and sit and go down, climb across a cliff and then down into a little cave alone at night to come into contact with these beings. And now I am hearing stories from a coroner about 17 cases of human mutilation that were carefully planned. The people were never anybody you would notice. They were always street people without any friends and just wanderers in these medium-sized cities in mid-state New York. And they would be taken. They would be mutilated with their lips cut off, their eyes cored out, their genitals and other parts of their bodies removed, their rectums cored out, when alive. Then they would be drowned in the ocean, which is a couple of 100 miles, 150 miles away at least, and I guess 90 miles away at the closest. And then they would be taken and put on rooftops in these towns or places near where they had been taken, apparently taken from. Now, was this a true story, or was it some kind of fallacious thing that I was being told in order to terrorize me? Who knows? But goodness, what if it's true? It was absolutely frightful. And, if their population is growing, perhaps they find us good, maybe we're good food and, they're thriving. What do you think of that?
Well, it's something that Mac read the graphic novel, The Nye Incident, and liked it enormously. And actually, I remember him and I commented just about the fact that it was very interesting to see your work done in the realm of a graphic novel. And that's almost more the realm that Mac worked in. The graphic novel by its very nature has this kind of
Mac was
youth-oriented.
Wonderful in that as an artist. You'll see on the Dreamland page on unknowncountry.com links to some of his work, and it's quite marvelous. Go ahead, Mike.
And he was very playful, and some of it is quite funny, and he was and quite perverse in the sense that he was sort of shameless in drawing gruesome, wrinkly creatures and things. So. But him and I talked at great length about the graphic novel and how the blending of the sort of raw illustration style and your treatment of something that is elusive in the sense that it's not the graphic novel isn't treated as a piece of nonfiction. It's using fiction as a tool to tell. To piece together some story that is that is basis in fact. So he was fascinated by that, and Mac didn't shy away from the scary stuff. He was quite fascinated by the periphery and the outlying things that show up in the gut of this phenomenon. And I also want to say it's very interesting. Right after the clip had finished playing, I have Mac Tonnies' book open, and I was going to interject, and I was going to read a clip an excerpt from page 25, and you read exactly the excerpt that I had in my hand, and my fingertip was right on that sentence when you started reading.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Mac made I can't tell from looking at it what it is. I guess it's probably a footwork done on the computer. It looks almost like it's like something that he actually made, like a sculpture, of a large, pale, scorpion-like creature.
Oh, I think that was taken from an art show in Kansas City.
Well, the thing that was bizarre about it is I have seen such a thing, a group of them, in fact, in my long history of bizarre experiences, and they were absolutely terrifying. I thought of them as some kind of demon. I was shocked they were even the same color to see that on his website, because I thought, why would somebody who's interested in this happen to pick up that particular image? And I have to ask you, was Mac himself involved? Did he have experiences?
Actually, I've asked him that many times, and the answer would be no. He didn't have any direct experience that he knew of. The reason I contacted Mac directly happened in 2007, probably in the spring of 2007. I had been dealing with a set of life events that was culminating, and I found that I just was no longer in a position. It just proved very unhealthy to try to deny my memories of events. And I heard Mac interviewed on a radio show called Denal of America, and that was where that first clip was taken from. And I immediately recognized that, I have to talk to this person. I was involved in the documentary for a short time about the abduction phenomena, and I used that in essence as a ploy to call him up and talk with him. And I literally just found his name in the Kansas City phone book and called him up, and I think that our very first phone conversation lasted 2.5 hours, and immediately we got along enormously well, and he was of all the people I've ever interacted with, and I've been to therapists trying to make sense of this, and I've talked with Leo Sprinkle and Bud Hopkins trying to make sense of my own experiences, and of all the people I've interacted with, Mac was by far the most helpful for me. really amazing character, really sensitive in a lot of ways, and really supportive in a lot of ways. And it was good to talk to someone who was so deeply intimate with the wide-ranging part of the theories, and not locked into any one little corner. Talking to someone like Bud Hopkins, it feels like he has he's a smart fellow, and there's a very kind side to him. But he's coming from a it seems like a small little puzzle piece. That's what the puzzle piece that he's focused on.
He's sure that he's got the answer, and he's gotten to be about fitting experiences into his theories. Mike, I'm sure everyone is as interested as I am in finding out what happened to you, and when we get back, it's exactly the question I'm going to ask. So if you need to knock back a few shots, do it now. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Dreamland. Serious wonder spoken here.
We're talking to Mike Cleland about his friend, the remarkable deceased investigator, Mac Tonnies' new book, The Cryptoterrestrials. And Mike, why don't you also tell us your website, if you will?
I have a blog where I've been writing about my experiences, and it's called Hidden Experience. And if you want to get a link to it, it's hiddenexperience.blogspot.com.
And you can click through from the Dreamland page or from the subscriber section of unknowncountry.com to his blog. And in the subscriber section, of course, you will be able to click through to it indefinitely, because our growing resource there goes back to 2004, and we don't have any intention of removing anything from it. So that if you're in this subscriber section, you'll be able to listen to this for years to come, which I think is very, very important, that a record like this be kept somewhere in this world. Now, before we go on, we're going to, in a few moments, we're going to ask Mike to tell us a little bit about his own experiences. But before that, Mac Tonnies left behind a number of audio clips in interviews, and this particular one is very trenchant and really tells it like it is about his thought about what the cryptoterrestrial phenomenon was all about. So let's listen to this first, and then when we get back, Mike will respond, as it were, with his own experiences.
And there are different ways of approaching this. One way of approaching it is that, these people in history, they were seeing aliens and seeing them in their own mythological context. They were seeing them in light of what they could handle. The other avenue that was explored by Jacques Vallée in his book Passport to Magonia,
right,
was that we're dealing with a phenomenon that's none of the above. It's an alien stimulus, and we don't know where exactly it's coming from. And each culture is seeing something that to them is perfectly valid, and to us we're seeing it, and it takes the form of space travelers, because that makes sense to us. It would be absurd for us to see little magical beings, because that doesn't jive with Western science, Western materialism. It's an outdated paradigm. So just because the aliens appear to be space travelers, at least in many respects, doesn't necessarily mean that they are. We could be dealing with something even stranger, and that's a problem that I've attempted to address with this cryptoterrestrial hypothesis. Could we be dealing with a species that evolves here on Earth that has deliberately insinuated itself into our mythologies, into our folklore, in an attempt to disguise itself, but at the same time perhaps exert some form of control over our social systems. Again, this is kind of Jacques Vallée's idea of a psychosocial thermostat or control system, and that it's kind of an ominous notion. It's not necessarily something you'd like to think about, that human existence is some sort of kept on a dial, and there's someone turning the dial, keeping everything in accordance with some ideal of which we know nothing. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's benign. Maybe this phenomenon and all this other strange phenomena that preceded it constitute something, an evolutionary process at work. Whitley Strieber has remarked once, and I thought it was a very astute observation. He said maybe the UFO phenomenon is nothing more than what evolution looks like to the conscious mind. And it's kind of a cryptic statement, kind of causes you to kind of scratch your head and think about it for a second. But, I think that's as good an explanation for the UFO phenomenon as any I've heard, quite honestly. And it could be entirely wrong, but I don't think that anyone has the answers, and that's one part of the UFO debate, such as it is, that I'm really dissatisfied with. I think the UFO debate has become excessively polarized in favor of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and in the years since that has become the veritable gospel of this strange phenomenon, this strange going on.
Is that because it's easier to comprehend?
I think you hit the nail on the head. Yeah, I think it's easier to comprehend. It's kind of a knee-jerk reaction. It makes sense. There's nothing wrong with it. And, we could be dealing with disparate phenomena that happen to look the same to us. I don't think we have any conclusive proof of that. And when people discuss the UFO controversy, it's almost always in terms of extraterrestrials. But the UFO phenomenon, as we popularly see it and talk about it and see it on films and et cetera, doesn't conform to what I personally would expect an alien civilization from another star system to look like. The behavior is very conspicuous. It seems to deliberately draw attention to itself at the same time that it denies its own existence.
Well, I must say that his comments about Jacques Vallée and Passport to Magonia in that clip excited me a lot, because Jacques is now working on another version, a new book that will replace Passport to Magonia. And I think Passport to Magonia was probably the most eye-opening UFO book I personally ever read. And so it's exciting to know that and to hear Mac's interest. Now, let's talk, though, about your experiences. And here you are, a man who's had close encounters and abduction experiences of some sort, and you are deeply involved in very experimental approaches to what happened. Tell us what you think did happen.
Well, about 2 months ago, Anne, your wife Anne, interviewed me for the subscriber section. So there's a link somewhere online there where you can listen to me telling about.
That's right. It's in the subscriber section. That's very true.
And it's very interesting. I'm extremely cautious to use the word abduction. I'm extremely cautious to quantify how it relates to UFOs, because from my direct memory, I don't have any of the memories that would show up in and I keep on using the term pop culture, but that would show up on a late night cable TV show, a scary documentary. I just simply don't have those experiences. What I do have is an intense set of experiences that are synchronistic, where these synchronistic events seem to show up and well up in my life, and oftentimes having to do with these experiences. I'll say that, and this is actually something that Mac was very cautious about how he spoke to me about it, and he said, he thought it was a dream, but I guess it would have been January or February of 1993. I was living at a house in Maine, and I woke up in my bedroom and looked out the window, and there was a bright light shining in the window, and it was very distressing. It just seemed like, well, why is that bright light? It wasn't shining in a way that a car would pull into the driveway. And I sat up in bed and looked out the window, and there was actually quite close to the window, not too far away, close enough that it was very, very vivid, were 5 now, with the classic gray aliens with the skinny, spindly bodies and the great big heads and the great big inky black eyes. So 5 of them, as far as I know, were standing directly outside my window, backlit by some incredibly bright light. And the bright light was smaller than I would have assumed. It didn't look like a giant, there's nothing to indicate a giant spaceship. The bright light was nothing more than something small. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like a movie light from a Hollywood set. The event lasted maybe 15 seconds. And what I did, if if I was responding rationally, I think I would have, screamed in terror and locked the doors. And but I didn't. What I did do, which is highly unusual, and is I simply said to myself, "Oh, they're here," and I laid my head down on the pillow and went right back to sleep, almost instantaneously.
Very typical. That happens to all of us, and we end up having to say, well, the most extraordinary thing you can possibly imagine happened, and then what did you do? Oh, well, I went back to sleep. It's just terrible, like the master of the key. I had this incredible conversation with this man. What did I do? I went back to sleep.
I will add that Mac had, he had his roots in this sort of cyberpunk, steampunk kind of literature. Stretching back to there's a fellow named William Gibson who he was a huge fan of. And,
I follow William Gibson on Twitter. I'm a huge fan of his too. And if you want to follow him on Twitter, his name on Twitter is Great Dismal, and his wife is also on Twitter. She's as Mrs. Great Dismal. So they're very cool. And you started this interview with that direct quote, which sounds exactly like something Mac would say. Where he wasn't very complimentary to your website, but at the same time, I will say, so this is like, I can say this straight up, he was a big fan of your work, and he read all your nonfiction stuff, and I think I want to say he read all your fiction books also, and he would constantly reference books that. I don't know if, like, a book like Billy, is that still available? He had, he had most of your books, even the ones that are hard to find now. And he was a big, you mentioned The Key, and he was a very big fan of The Key and referenced that a lot. And then this is something he's said more than once, and I've heard him say it on audio interviews. The only book he's ever read twice was Majestic. He was a voracious reader, and he just delighted in that book. He said it was sort of magically creepy. The thing about that whole Roswell incident is that, my family was involved in it. My uncle was one of the officers who tried to reassemble the debris at Wright Field. So it's hard for me to think it was that it didn't exist. And he talks about Nick Redfern's take on it and so forth, which I thought was really weak, but not because of the fact that his research is poor. I think his research is very good, but because I have a personal family connection to what actually happened. But here's also what I know. No one was ever able to figure out what the debris actually was, except that it was technologically bizarrely advanced. That was all. And then later, when electron microscopes came in, they found that this material had been worked metallurgically at the molecular level. It was consisted of things that had been welded together molecule by molecule, which is bizarre beyond belief. It's so advanced. In any case, I think I've digressed a little bit here, and I apologize, folks. I'm talking too much during this interview, but I've got a lot to say about Mac as well and his work. But my point is this, with regard to Majestic and with regard to the whole Roswell incident. Something happened, and I think Mac would agree with that. But the assumption that it was a UFO incident and a scout ship from another world or something, which is what the Air Force initially thought, is totally unproven. But go ahead.
Yes, and I think he would jump in and agree with you wholeheartedly that it's very easy to jump to that conclusion, though that certainly may not be true. That there's nothing. And Mac was very clear that he said it very well might be an extraterrestrial hypothesis that solves all of this, but he just felt that it's not serving anyone to be stuck in that. It may be a piece of it, but there's no reason to get locked into that one view. And did you ever read Mac's other book, which was called After the Martian Apocalypse?
No, I did not.
He wrote a book. he wrote a book which was published in 2004 called After the Martian Apocalypse, where he basically, once again, just as a thought experiment, speculated on the fact that there's evidence on Mars of whether it's a base that was put there by extraterrestrials, or some sort of community that was put, that was there, a non-human community that was there. And this is going directly back to the face on Mars image that showed up in from the Viking 1 photograph. The book was, I have to praise the book highly, because he does the thing that he does so beautifully, where he speaks almost in a conversational tone and just kind of implores that we need to speculate on what may or may not be. And he also said that this is eminently testable. If you want to know whether that face on Mars is a face, we're now we have command of NASA could easily send a craft there and land a robot right near there, and he, which is beautifully presumptuous from basically a kid in his 20s writing a book, needling NASA, saying, like, you're dropping the ball. You have geologists and astronomers on staff. You need to have archaeologists on staff as part of the Martian exploration process. And by the mere fact that they don't have archaeologists on there, it just means that they are utterly closed off to even the concept. I don't think he saw any deep, grand conspiracies, and he was looking for them. And he sort of thought it was just a institutional closed-mindedness that shut the NASA folks off from looking deeper into this.
I know a number of the people at JPL who are looking into this and are very interested in the whole idea of something else going on Mars, but they absolutely cannot look at it, not because of any conspiracy, but because of a sort of if you will, an academic conspiracy against looking at things like that, because the idea that it might be, let me rephrase this, anyone who came across evidence like that and presented it would have their career absolutely on the line. And even if the evidence proved eventually to be true, they would go the way, before that happened, of so many scientists who have initially brought forth highly controversial material only to see their lives and their careers destroyed, and then later, after have already left the stage of history, to have their work accepted, and they don't want that to happen to them, and therefore they keep quiet.
And I'll add that Mac was born on August 20th, 1975, and that was the very same day that Viking 1 was launched from this Earth, the very same day he was born. And that was the orbiter that took that initial photograph of the face on Mars, the one that started all that grand speculation on what may or may not be there. So, and I just thought that was very delightful little effect.
It's indeed. I didn't know that, of course, and it is very delightful. Let me ask you this, and I may have missed it in reading the Cryptoterrestrials, but I'm not aware of much mention, and please correct me if I'm wrong, of the dead in relation to the visitors in Mac's work. I don't think it was in there. And I've read it a couple times, partially as doing the illustrations in the process, and so no, I don't think it's mentioned there at all. Well, I think it's a big part of it, and I wonder if it's not a secret he now knows. We have come just about to the end of our time together, and I would like to read to you, if I may, folks, from Mac's book, from the very end of it, and this is not giving anything away. The book is still marvelous, and there's a lot more to read. This is not a thriller or anything. Although I harbor serious reservations about humanity's ability to make the evolutionary cut, I'm not without hope. I sense great things in the making. I enjoy experiencing this dire, ever-accelerating point in our species' history. our potential as genuine cosmic citizens, challenging the imagination and stretching conceptual boundaries to dizzying extremes. I'm willing to embrace transcendence or endure extinction. I must perpetually concede either possibility, no matter how dramatically different, regardless of how exciting or dismal. I walk a fine existential edge, fearing and cherishing, enlivened by a vertiginous sense of astonishment and horror. And so it is that he has walked that edge into the beyond, embracing transcendence and extinction both, I would think. I would like to thank you, Mike, very much for this lovely interview. And have you any final words to say about Mac and his work? If so, please do so now.
Mac was a beautiful conversationalist. He was a beautiful speaker, and he was entirely gifted, and he had something that is so enviable where he could summarize very complex ideas into something that was absolutely delightful and engaging, and I miss him deeply.
He might have taken us down a very important road had he lived. Mac Tonnies, the Cryptoterrestrials.
But there was a previous condition where he did end up in the hospital getting tests, where he had passed out at his place of work, and that would have been less than a year before his very untimely death. So
he had, basically what you're saying is that he had an occult heart condition, and that's very sad because those I guess they can be hard to detect. In any case, we lost a fascinating researcher. And what made him fascinating to me was his refusal to accept the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I'm also good friends with Jacques Vallée, and I think that he respected Jacques Vallée's work very much. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis is?
Well, the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis is, and he got that term from someone else on his blog. He has he for almost 7 or 8 years he had been keeping an online blog called Post-Human Blues.
Yes.
Much of it was just musings and oftentimes funny little things, but at the same time he would include a lot of his own writing and a lot of his own thoughts, and he began pondering the fact that maybe it
was frightening, and it had quieted down since I left, and they were all glad I had gone. For quite a few years, I tried to find out who said that, because there were only a few people who lived on that road. Nobody's been willing to own up to it, but if it did anything, it stopped the fusillade of comments saying I was a nut and all of these things. So when Mac died last year, I was hesitant to do anything about it, but a dear friend of Mac's, Mike Cleland, has wanted to talk about him and about his work, and there's much more to Mac than those particular comments. Mac takes a very interesting viewpoint about the whole phenomenon, and his last book, The Cryptoterrestrials, is now available, and I think it's well worth taking a look at Mac and his work. Now that we no longer have him with us, or even before, I should have probably done this while he was alive, but who knew that a man would die suddenly at the age of 34? So now I welcome his good friend, Mike Cleland, to Dreamland to talk about Mac. Welcome, Mike.
When you first asked me to talk about Mac, I was a little bit hesitant because I didn't want to put words into his mouth, but at the same time, he was quite a good friend, and I was deeply honored to know him. And just to have this chance to talk about him and to praise him would be just felt great. So.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. Mac had a very unique take. Well, perhaps we'd better say first, after just passing over his untimely death so quickly, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what happened.
Well, I talked to Mac's mother shortly after his death, and she called me up out of the blue. I did illustrations for the book, which was published posthumously, which is titled The Cryptoterrestrials. And she called me up to thank me for doing the illustrations. And Mac was 34 years old and I talked to him in the middle of 2009. He died on October 18th of 2009. And he had an event where he had a fainting spell. And he went to the hospital, and they did a lot of tests on him, and he was young and healthy, and they couldn't quite factor anything in, and it was presumed to be some heart issue. And he died, as far as anyone knows, peacefully in his sleep. He was found in bed, and of some sort of heart arrhythmia. So just basically his heart stopped, and no one has a good answer to exactly why that happened. These things that we call extraterrestrials, that we in our pop culture have an image of these characters, coming down on metal spaceships to perform scientific experiments and collect data. In essence, we're anthropomorphizing them to be us. That's exactly what we do when we go to the moon. We take soil samples and fly in metal spaceships. So in essence, that's a very easy for us to grasp in a pop culture sort of metaphor. But he was curious whether whatever they might be, and he was very cautious to when he was speculating to in essence say I'm speculating and not treat anything as not dogma. But there's very little evidence that they're from outer space. In fact, there's no evidence that they're from outer space, except for the fact that every once in a while someone will have a conversation with them, and they'll say they're from a place in outer space. But he was curious whether they were somehow sharing our world with us right now, and somehow whether they were had been here in an ancient form of intelligence that had been sharing the planet with us, or a somehow hidden or impoverished non-human intelligence that shared the planet with us, and whether they were somehow...
2005, I became aware of I wouldn't call him exactly a UFO researcher. I think he would have objected to that term. We'll see why in a few minutes. His name was Mac Tonnies, and when I first became aware of him, it was because he had written something particularly unpleasant about me. He wrote, "Whitley Strieber has written his most expansive, bizarre online journal entry yet. As usual, it poses far more questions than it answers. And for a metaphysical rallying cry, it's peculiarly insistent that readers who truly support his website send him money so they can access some superfluous subscriber material." So naturally, I wasn't. He went on in this genre mode for quite a while, and then it was followed by a long list of comments about me, most of them very unpleasant. But then suddenly, toward the end of this list, and what ended the list, I guess, was someone who wrote something quite unexpected to me. This man wrote this: "I lived on the same road to Strieber when he had his little cabin in Accord, New York. Frankly, there was a light that would come over his place at night. It would sometimes make a noise as well, a faint sort of moaning sound. I must have seen it dozens of times." And then he goes on to say that the